Edward Ryder Howard never believed in borrowing trouble, but it sure had a way of finding its way up his dirt road whether invited or not. 68 years of hard-earned pragmatism taught him that most problems in life could be solved with patience, a torque wrench, and the kind of stare that made grown men rethink their tone. His land, 172 acres of weather-worn pasture stretching out under the desert sun of northern New Mexico, was more than just property. It was his rhythm, the wind through the cattle gates, the creak of the porch under his boots, the long silences that stretched between sunsets. This was a place that asked for little and gave back in kind, so long as you respected it. The ranch had been in the Howard family for 3 generations, passed from men who didn't waste time explaining themselves. Ryder had inherited it after the slow decline and final breath of his Uncle Thomas, who'd left behind no children, just a reputation as a solitary man with a mean sense of humor and a dead-on shot. For the last 2 decades, Ryder had run the place with quiet consistency, fixing what needed fixing, raising beef cattle in small numbers, and occasionally renting parts of the South Field to an old friend who grew alfalfa. It wasn't glamorous and it wasn't loud, but it was his. He wasn't entirely off the grid, though he'd been accused of it more than once. There was a power line running down the east side, a landline in the kitchen, and a battered laptop that he used mostly to check weather reports and order parts when the feed store didn't have what he needed. He'd never once joined a social media site, didn't care who was trending, and couldn't tell you the name of a single celebrity under the age of 60. He didn't mind that the world was spinning faster and louder. It could spin all it wanted, just so long as it didn't try to spin onto his land. 5 years ago, a new housing development had started creeping up the ridge to the north. Small, boxy houses with fake stone facades and neatly trimmed lawns, built on subdivided parcels of once wild land that used to serve as natural grazing routes. Ryder hadn't been thrilled, but he didn't complain either. He'd learned early in life that barking at change didn't stop it from happening, and besides, his property line had been clearly established for over 70 years. The land was deeded, the road was private, and he paid the taxes to prove it. As long as they stayed on their side, he'd stay on his. But things didn't stay simple. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning just after the summer rains had finished soaking the canyon trails. Ryder had gone into town for feed, his usual monthly haul, enough alfalfa, pellets, and supplements to keep the cattle in good shape during the hottest stretch of the season. It was nearly a 4-hour round trip, made longer by the detour he had to take thanks to a washed-out creek bed near the southern fence line. He pulled up the dusty incline toward the north gate, tired but satisfied, ready for coffee and silence. Instead, his headlights fell on steel. Not a fallen tree or a wrecked vehicle. No, this was man-made. A new gate had been installed across his road, thick powder-coated steel anchored into freshly poured concrete. On either side, new fencing extended toward the brush line, still gleaming in the fading light. A blinking red sensor scanned across his windshield as he pulled up, and then a mechanical voice chirped through a cheap speaker mounted on the post. "Access restricted. Authorized residents only." The voice was female, flat, and pre-recorded. It wasn't the kind of message that invited negotiation. Ryder braked and sat motionless for several long seconds. Then, slowly, he stepped out of the truck, his boots hitting the dirt with a measured finality. He walked up to the gate and placed a hand on the cold metal. Welded, solid, reinforced joints. Professionally installed. This wasn't some neighborhood prank. Someone had paid real money to put this here, and more importantly, someone had done it without his permission. At first, he thought he'd maybe missed a letter, or that the county had screwed something up, some bureaucratic misfire that would be cleared with a few calls. But there was no county seal on the warning sign zip-tied to the gate, just a sleek logo with a tree, a circle of stars, and the words, Whispering Ridge Residential Council. Ryder recognized the name. It was the self-appointed body that governed the new development to the north, a group of overeager transplant retirees and over-leveraged professionals who held meetings about fence colors and lawn watering schedules. He hadn't interacted with them, hadn't needed to. They didn't have jurisdiction over his land. So why the hell was their gate on his road? He tried to call the number printed at the bottom of the sign, but the phone rang to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. Instead, he reversed the truck, drove the long way around to the Southern Access Trail, an old maintenance path that hadn't seen use in years, and finally made it back to the house just as the last of the daylight disappeared behind the ridge. He didn't eat. He didn't sit down. He went straight to the filing cabinet in his office and pulled out every piece of paper he had. Deeds, surveys, county approvals. Line by line, he verified that the road was on his land, that the easements were intact, that no agreements had ever been signed transferring authority. Nothing had changed. Except now, someone was treating his private road like it belonged to them. By the next morning, his email inbox had 2 messages. One from a generic residential access coordinator informing him that a new gate system had been installed to protect community integrity, and one from a woman named Pamela Stroud, president of the Whispering Ridge Council, welcoming him to a new chapter of shared responsibility. She stated with almost comical confidence that because his road was being commonly accessed by new homeowners, it was now considered a shared benefit corridor and would be managed accordingly. He reread that last line 3 times. Then, slowly and deliberately, he typed his response. I don't know who told you this land is part of your jurisdiction. It's not. Remove your gate by Friday, or I will. He didn't get a reply. By Thursday, another camera had gone up. By Friday, the keypad was replaced with a biometric scanner. Ryder drove into town, picked up a pad of legal forms, and called a lawyer he knew from way back, a guy named Len who'd helped him years ago with a boundary dispute when a neighbor tried to claim water rights he didn't have. Len remembered him, said he'd make some calls. In the meantime, Ryder waited, walking the perimeter of his land like a restless ghost, watching the gate from a distance as if it might blink first. It didn't, and neither did he. Something had changed. This wasn't just about a gate anymore. Someone was trying to force a hand that hadn't asked to be played. The land was speaking to him in the only language it knew: obstruction, pressure, challenge, and Ryder had no intention of letting it go unanswered. Ryder knew better than to waste time expecting common sense from people who wrote bylaws for a neighborhood where the only wild animal left was a squirrel too fat to climb trees. But even he was caught off guard by the speed and boldness of what came next. By Monday morning, a new sign had gone up just beyond the gate, this time bolted into the ground with concrete anchors. Pending easement transition. Authorized entry only. Contact Residential Council for permits. The language was vague, purposefully non-legal, designed to sound official without holding any real weight. But it made one thing clear. Whoever was behind this wasn't just putting up fences. They were staking a claim. Ryder stared at the sign in silence for a long minute, then turned on his heel and walked back to his truck, not out of resignation but because he knew better than to argue with metal and paint. You dealt with people, not props, and he needed to find the person pulling the strings. He didn't have to look far. The email address listed at the bottom of the sign belonged to none other than Pamela Stroud, the same woman who had sent him the passive-aggressive welcome letter. After calling the number 3 times without answer, Ryder finally decided to show up in person. The Whispering Ridge Council office was a room inside a community clubhouse barely larger than a gas station lobby, all polished surfaces and plastic ferns. He didn't bother to dress up for the visit. Faded jeans, flannel shirt, boots dusted with the same dirt that had settled into the lines of his face years ago. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there to end something. Pamela was everything he expected and more. Polished in the way people got when they had never cleaned a tool in their life, her smile was stretched too wide, her perfume too sharp, her words rehearsed like a pitch meeting. She didn't invite him to sit. She stood, hands folded in front of her like a museum docent, and immediately began explaining the transition plan for the northern corridor of the development. She used words like communal harmony and integration strategy, and said it all in the same tone someone might use to describe seasonal brunch rotations. Ryder didn't interrupt. He just stared until she finally faltered. When he did speak, it was quiet and clipped. He laid down copies of his land survey, the deed, and the registered plat map from the county recorder's office. He pointed to the northern road and said, "Mine." Then he asked what legal authority gave her permission to install a gate on private property without owner consent. Pamela didn't answer directly. She talked about neighborhood votes and community sentiment and how several new homeowners were concerned about unmonitored access points. She mentioned safety. She mentioned property values. She mentioned the word cohesion 3 times in 2 minutes. Then she smiled again and said, "Let's not escalate this." Ryder leaned forward slightly, the way a man does when he's giving a final warning. "Ma'am, this isn't a debate. You've got until the end of the week to take that gate down. Or I will. You can call whatever meeting you want, but if one more screw goes into my soil, we're going to stop talking and start documenting damages." Pamela blinked, but the smile didn't drop. It only got thinner, like a knife edge being honed. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said. "This is a changing neighborhood, Mr. Howard. Everyone has to adapt." He nodded once. "You first." He walked out without waiting for a reply. That night, the gate clicked shut with a heavy mechanical whine, and for the first time in decades, Ryder slept with one eye open, the old revolver he hadn't touched in years now resting on the nightstand out of principle more than fear. The next day, he got his answer, not from Pamela, but from a delivery driver who called him from a gas station 20 minutes away, confused and apologetic. The biometric scanner wouldn't accept outside access codes, and the driver had been turned away. Ryder had been waiting on a shipment of irrigation pipe for over a week. Without it, he couldn't redirect the runoff from the cattle pens, and by the following afternoon, standing water had begun pooling in the lower field, soaking into the feed ground and attracting flies. The delay wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was sabotage, disguised in the language of community safety. By Wednesday, Ryder's attorney finally got back to him with confirmation. The road belonged to him, legally and exclusively. There had been no votes passed, no easements granted, no claims filed through proper county channels. Everything Pamela had done was unauthorized, illegal. But the law, as Len explained on the phone, had its own pace, and getting an injunction to force the removal of the gate could take weeks. "She's banking on you losing patience," Len said. "She wants you to make a mistake." Ryder didn't respond immediately. He just looked out the window at the dirt track now blocked by someone else's idea of control and said, "She's about to find out what losing looks like." On Thursday morning, a maintenance crew showed up with orange vests and clipboards, claiming to be upgrading the safety infrastructure. Ryder intercepted them halfway up the road, asked for paperwork, and when they couldn't produce any, he told them to turn around and not come back without a warrant or a lawyer. They left without argument, but they didn't look surprised. One of them nodded slightly, almost respectful, like a man recognizing another who knows how to stand his ground. But that same afternoon, something else happened. Something that made Ryder realize this wasn't just about a gate anymore. He found tire tracks behind the barn. Not his, not the ranch hands. Fresh, wide, heavy. He followed them to where they stopped beside the secondary well pump, an older system, rarely used but still operational and crucial during high-demand weeks. The access hatch had been tampered with. A small panel was pried loose and the cover plate was left resting askew like someone had been interrupted. No damage done yet, but it was a message. Ryder didn't call the sheriff. He took photos, secured the panel with reinforced bolts, and rigged a motion sensor to a portable alarm inside the pump shed. If they came back, he'd know. That night he sat on the porch with a mug of coffee that went cold before he touched it. He didn't pace. He didn't rant. He just watched the dark horizon like it owed him answers. something had shifted. This wasn't neighborhood theater anymore. This was a push, a test. And Ryder Howard, for all his age and weathered skin, wasn't a man who failed quietly. The legal papers would come in time. The county would get involved eventually. But right now, someone was making moves like they had the right to rewrite boundaries with zip ties and fences. Someone thought he was too slow, too old, too out of step to stop them. They were about to find out just how wrong that assumption was. The gate didn't come down. Not after the warning, not after the confrontation, not even after the legal documents Ryder's attorney emailed to Pamela Stroud and her so-called residential counsel. In fact, what followed was a hardening, a kind of silent doubling down. 2 days after the maintenance crew backed off and the tracks behind the barn were discovered, a new piece of fencing appeared at the southern boundary. This one not just obstructing the road, but cutting directly across part of the pasture. It wasn't even straight, just awkwardly angled from a clump of scrub oak toward the utility pole that marked the edge of his property. Bright orange plastic netting had been wrapped around the metal poles like a construction site perimeter. No warning, no notice. Just there, mocking him. Ryder took it down with bolt cutters and threw the entire mess into the back of his truck. He didn't say anything to anyone that day. He didn't call his lawyer. He didn't try to get someone on the phone. He just walked the perimeter again, this time slower, checking for tracks, for fresh disturbances in the dirt, for anything out of place, and that's when he found the drone. It was lodged halfway into a mesquite branch, battery blinking, one propeller bent at a sharp angle like a broken wing. Consumer grade, but not cheap. It had fallen hard, probably during a storm the night before. He brought it back inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and plugged it into his laptop. Not out of curiosity, but because something about it gnawed at him. Sure enough, the last dozen video files were stored on board. No encryption, no watermark. Just raw footage. His land, his house, his livestock, his truck pulling up the ridge, close-ups of the barn, the irrigation setup, the south fence line. At one point, the camera zoomed in on his back porch where he could be seen drinking coffee at sunrise, completely unaware he was being watched. Ryder sat in front of the screen for a long time, motionless while the tiny video windows played in sequence. Then he closed the laptop, went out to the shop and spent the next 2 hours rewiring the motion sensors around the house and installing new trail cameras along the access paths. Not because he was afraid, but because he needed to be ready. The next morning, he got a call from the county assessor's office. The woman on the line was polite, almost apologetic, but firm. She said they had received a request for jurisdictional reassessment from a registered development body regarding an unincorporated access corridor adjacent to his property. Ryder didn't interrupt. He just let her talk. According to her, the request involved a proposal to bring a small segment of the road, his road, under shared maintenance oversight, citing public interest access and emergency infrastructure coverage. Ryder asked a single question. Who signed that request? There was a pause on the line, paper shuffling in the background, the faint sound of a keyboard. Then she said, Pamela Stroud, acting president of Whispering Ridge Council. He hung up without another word. By dusk, he had the bulldozer pulled out of storage. It hadn't been started in 2 years. The diesel was old. The battery took coaxing. But by 9 that night, it roared to life under the glow of a halogen work light mounted on the pole behind the barn. The sound cut through the valley like a warning shot. He didn't take it up the road yet. He didn't need to. Not yet. But the message was clear. Escalation wasn't just an option anymore. It was a path someone else had chosen, and he was going to walk it all the way through. The next blow didn't come from the gate or the fence or the council. It came from his water supply. Saturday morning, while doing his usual system check, Ryder noticed the pressure was down on the primary line that fed the cattle troughs. The gauge wasn't reading 0, but it was hovering far too low for comfort. He traced it back to the south valve near the hill where the backup well pump was housed. When he opened the control box, he saw the Sabotage. 2 of the wires had been pulled from their terminals and tucked back inside to make it look like a mechanical failure. Someone had cut his water. Deliberately. Cleanly. Professionally. He fixed it. Took him an hour. But that wasn't the point. The point was someone had crossed into physical damage. Property destruction. And they'd done it with enough care to make it seem like a fluke. Ryder didn't call the police. He didn't trust the local department to understand the difference between a community complaint and an orchestrated land grab. Instead, he sent the photos to his lawyer with a brief message. They touched my water. That afternoon, Pamela Stroud showed up at his gate. Not alone. She arrived in a dark blue SUV with tinted windows and 2 men in business casual attire. One holding a laptop case, the other a clipboard. Ryder stood at the gate with arms crossed as she stepped out and gave him that same tight, polished smile he'd seen back at the clubhouse. She gestured at the others, saying they were urban planners assisting with community infrastructure expansion. He said nothing. She told him there was no need for hostilities, that the proposal was temporary, that if he would just sign a letter of entry, they could move forward peacefully and ensure his property remains compatible with the long-term design vision. Ryder glanced at the clipboard. 4 pages of legal fog. No title, no letterhead. Just paragraphs of vague terms, transition authority, property access rights, utility coordination. Ryder reached out slowly, took the clipboard, held it like something fragile, and then handed it back without looking down. "Get off my land," he said. Pamela blinked, her smile not budging, but her eyes narrowing slightly. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be, Mr. Howard. If you continue down this road, you'll leave us no choice but to escalate to legal enforcement." Ryder stepped forward, just enough for her to take a small step back. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't raising his voice. But there was something in the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like a man measuring the weight of each moment before letting it drop. "You think this is hard?" he said. "I've buried calves in the frost with my bare hands. I've watched drought burn through my pasture till the dust looked like smoke. I've spent more nights fixing busted pumps than you've spent in this town. You don't know hard, but you're about to learn." She stood there for a beat longer, then nodded to her companions, who turned without protest and got back into the SUV. The tires kicked up dust as they reversed down the road. Ryder didn't move until they disappeared from view. Then he turned, walked back to the house, and wrote down every detail from the meeting before it could fade from memory. By Sunday morning, he had new locks installed on the shed, cameras re-angled to cover blind spots, and a fresh set of steel panels loaded onto the trailer just in case. He wasn't paranoid. He wasn't playing defense. He was preparing. Because if they wanted to find out what it meant to push a man who had already buried more than most people ever grow, they were welcome to try. And when they did, he'd be waiting. Not with speeches, not with threats, just with resolve, and a machine that didn't care about signatures. By the time Monday came around, Ryder had begun to accept a grim truth. Not that the conflict was escalating, he'd already understood that, but that it was being orchestrated by people who didn't need to break laws to make his life impossible. They were weaponizing delay, exploiting silence, hiding behind language that sounded official but lacked substance. The kind of tactics that didn't leave bruises, just paperwork and fatigue. What made it worse was that they were good at it. Too good. This wasn't a fight between neighbors. It was a campaign, quiet and bureaucratic, aimed at forcing him to surrender not because they had the right, but because they assumed he didn't have the endurance. Ryder wasn't sure when exactly he'd crossed the line between resisting and preparing for war, but it was somewhere between replacing a Sabotage junction box and finding a notice pinned to his back gate. A courtesy advisory stating that the council would be hosting a regional boundary meeting on his behalf the following Thursday. On his behalf. Without invitation, without his name, without his consent. It was laughable, if it hadn't also been deadly serious. The language had shifted from suggestion to assumption. They were now treating his land as already integrated, not in negotiation. He didn't go to the meeting. Instead, he sent his lawyer, Len, who returned the same evening looking both tired and impressed. According to Len, the meeting had been held at a rented conference room near the local town hall, where Pamela and her carefully curated circle had presented a slideshow titled Reclaiming Underutilized Spaces, the Northern Parcel Initiative. There were maps, doctored to include Ryder's property shaded in pastel green, labeled Future Trails, and Community Resource Integration. There were phrases like silent easement and non-asset conversion, neither of which had legal standing but sounded just ambiguous enough to confuse anyone not paying attention. They had even invited a representative from the county's regional planning department, young, polite, and clearly overwhelmed, who nodded vaguely through the presentation and took notes, probably for no other reason than to protect their own office. But Len had spoken, firmly, publicly, on record. He laid out the facts, the deed, the private road, the survey lines, the unauthorized installations. He submitted photos of the sabotaged well, the drone footage, and the falsified map overlays. The room had gone cold, according to Len. No one shouted, no one argued. They just listened in silence as the illusion of control began to crack. Pamela had tried to save face by saying everything was still in discussion, that the gate was a temporary measure, but even the county rep seemed to recoil at the mention of temporary access denial. By the end of the meeting, Len had done more damage to their operation than Ryder ever could with a bulldozer. He hadn't won the war, but he'd exposed it for what it was, a coordinated land absorption attempt masquerading as neighborhood improvement. Ryder thanked him with a handshake and a quiet, "We're not done yet." The next day brought rain, steady, slow, unrelenting, the kind that sank into the bones of the soil and forced everything to pause. Ryder welcomed it. It gave him space to think. While the ranch waited out the storm, he walked the halls of his house like a general between battles, checking locks, measuring feed, cleaning tools. The gate remained shut. The road remained blocked. The cameras blinked their silent rhythm through the fog. But now he wasn't alone. He received a call that evening from one of his neighbors, a man named Carl, who owned a parcel downwind of the ridge but rarely spoke unless it was about fencing or livestock feed prices. Carl said he'd heard what happened at the meeting. He didn't want trouble. He didn't want lawsuits. But he wanted Ryder to know he'd received a letter too, not as aggressive, but similar. A suggestion that his water line might be better managed if included in the ridge's infrastructure. He hadn't replied, didn't plan to, but something about the tone had set him on edge. That call changed everything, because if it was happening to Carl, it was happening to others. Ryder didn't start a movement. He wasn't interested in alliances or public speeches, but he made a decision to stop treating this as a personal attack. It was a pattern, a strategy, one property at a time, slow enough that no one noticed, soft enough that no one reacted. He just happened to be the one who fought back, and that meant they were probably getting nervous. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. When the rain broke and the sky cleared, Ryder went to the gate one last time and stared at it not with anger, but calculation. He knew what had to come next. Not because he wanted it, but because there was no other way left to say. This land is not for sale, not for lease, and sure as hell not for taking. They had forced him to draw a line. Now he was going to show them what crossing it looked like. The next phase didn't begin with violence, but with silence. The kind of intentional, strategic silence that comes when someone's been backed into a corner and begins calculating their counterattack with a calm, so deliberate it feels almost civilized. That's what made it more dangerous. Pamela Stroud didn't storm the ranch gates or file another complaint or even bother replying to Ryder's cease and desist letter. She simply went quiet, and for 3 whole days, nothing moved on the ridge. The gate remained locked, the cameras continued blinking, and the community newsletter made no mention of the Northern Parcel Initiative. Ryder knew better than to trust that calm. People like Pamela didn't disappear. They retreated, reloaded, and re-emerged in a different shape, behind a different mask. And that shape arrived on a Thursday morning in the form of a county code enforcement vehicle. It rolled up the long stretch of the public access road just after 9 a.m. Spotless, slow-moving, and driven by a man with a clipboard who looked like he hadn't seen a pasture in years. He introduced himself as Martin Dale, Regulatory Compliance Officer, sent in response to concerns raised by members of the adjacent development regarding potential violations on Ryder's property. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He simply said he needed to verify a few things and would only be a few minutes. Ryder didn't block the man's path. He had nothing to hide. The pasture was clean, the waste was properly stored, and the water lines were repaired and documented. But he followed Dale every step of the way, and he watched as the man took photographs of perfectly functional equipment, noted the type of fencing, measured the distance between the cattle troughs and the boundary line. Then, just before leaving, Dale produced a form, unsigned but already filled in, recommending that Ryder undergo an environmental assessment due to unclear watershed management practices. Ryder didn't raise his voice. He simply asked, "Did Pamela send you?" The man hesitated, just for a second. But it was enough. She's the one who filed the request, isn't she? Dale straightened slightly and said, "The request came from a licensed representative of the council, yes. I'm just doing the legwork." Ryder nodded, accepted the form without comment, and then stood watching as the vehicle rolled back down the hill and disappeared. The air that day felt thick, heavy with heat and the kind of pressure that comes right before the sky cracks open. He spent the afternoon not working but walking, inspecting every inch of fence line, double-checking the trail cams, making sure every gate latch was secure. Not because he expected an attack, but because he needed to be ready for the moment someone tried to escalate things again under the cover of the rules and paperwork. That moment came sooner than expected. 2 days later, the livestock feed delivery he had scheduled weeks ago was denied entry at the community checkpoint, the same one Pamela's people had installed under the guise of safety enhancement. The driver called Ryder from the front of the gate, confused and apologetic, explaining that a representative from the council had informed him the road was temporarily restricted due to an ongoing jurisdictional review. Ryder told the man to wait, climbed into his truck, and within 15 minutes, he was standing face-to-face with a 20-something guard in a fluorescent vest who wouldn't even make eye contact. "You're blocking my delivery," Ryder said. "I was just told no one comes through unless their name's on the registry, sir." "Registry of what?" "The Northern Corridor Access List." Ryder exhaled slowly, nodded once, and turned back toward the feed truck. "You see that turnoff down there?" he said, pointing to a dirt path just before the gate. "That's an old service trail. Follow it halfway and cut right. You'll see a break in the fence. I'll meet you on the other side." The driver hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Son," Ryder said, "if they had the right to stop you, you wouldn't be on the phone with me." 20 minutes later, the feed was unloaded, and Ryder watched the truck roll back toward the highway with dust trailing behind it like smoke from a small, efficient rebellion. He didn't speak that evening. He didn't write letters or emails. He just sat on the porch, sharpening tools in the fading light one by one like he used to when winter storms loomed over the mesa and the electricity became more of a suggestion than a guarantee. It wasn't about the tools. It was about rhythm, focus, resolve. The next day, he received a notice in the mail, printed on heavy, cream-colored paper with the Whispering Ridge logo embossed at the top. It was styled like a formal memo but reeked of desperation. It stated that due to aggressive and hostile conduct, the council had voted to impose a temporary access suspension to Ryder's property pending legal review, citing community endangerment concerns. It also included a list of alleged Infractions, most of them vague, some entirely fabricated, including verbal intimidation, unauthorized road usage, and failure to comply with cooperative land use transition requests. Ryder stood in his kitchen, reading the letter over a pot of boiling coffee, and by the time he finished, he was already pulling on his boots. He didn't take the truck. He took the dozer. He'd been waiting, not in fear, in calculation. By noon, the sound of diesel thundered across the valley as Ryder guided the rusted yellow machine up the north path, slow and patient, with the kind of deliberation usually reserved for laying foundation or clearing rock slides. As he reached the metal gate that had started it all, reinforced, camera-equipped, smug in its placement, he didn't hesitate. He lowered the blade, eased forward, and with the kind of calm usually reserved for prayer, drove directly through the structure until steel bent and concrete cracked and the cameras blinked out like lights at the end of a show. Behind him, the wind picked up, scattering dust and fragments into the pasture grass. Ahead of him, a few cars from the development slowed, watched, didn't stop. They didn't honk. They didn't roll down their windows. They just drove past, slower than usual, as if realizing something irreversible had just taken place. Ryder parked the dozer just beyond the remains of the gate, climbed down, and walked the fence line, pulling up the supports one by one with a crowbar until nothing remained but broken ground and a clear road. No spectacle. No speeches. Just work, plain and unremarkable, except for the fact that it was no longer about repairs or protection. It was reclamation. Reclaiming what had been his before they tried to take it under the illusion of cooperation. He left the twisted remains of the gate piled neatly to the side of the road. Not hidden, not cleaned up, just stacked like evidence, waiting for whoever thought they had the right to explain themselves. And he waited. Not because he needed backup, but because he knew, after everything they'd tried, every delay, every lie, every piece of paper dressed up to look like law, that they wouldn't call the police. Because that would mean answering questions. And Pamela wasn't ready for that. Not yet. They didn't call the police that day, or the next, and that told Ryder everything he needed to know. If they'd had any real authority, if their claims were backed by anything more substantial than empty signatures and cosmetic bylaws, they would have had the sheriff on his porch by sundown. But no one came. Not the police. Not Pamela. Not even the clipboard peddlers she usually sent in her place. The silence that followed the destruction of the gate wasn't the offended cry of a wounded institution. It was the stunned quiet of someone realizing they'd misjudged a man so completely that they no longer knew what to do next. But Ryder wasn't under any illusion that the fight was over. He didn't believe in fairy tale endings, and he knew how bureaucracy worked. If they couldn't stop him with fencing or false notices, they'd find another way. Paper trails, county leverage, civil litigation. He'd hit them hard, yes, but now he had to be ready for the real war, the kind fought in courtrooms, not on dirt roads. He spent the next 48 hours preparing. His lawyer, Len, filed a formal motion demanding the immediate and permanent removal of any unauthorized structures on Ryder's land and petitioned the county for an emergency clarification of boundary jurisdiction. Len wasn't an aggressive man by nature, but after weeks of watching Ryder get harassed and maneuvered by a group of petty suburban tyrants playing dress-up with legal language, he had no problem drafting the kind of language that snapped necks in. Municipal offices. Meanwhile, Ryder documented everything. Video of the demolition, photographs of every fence post he'd removed, copies of every letter, every drone shot, every fake memo. He organized it not out of fear of reprisal, but because he knew people like Pamela didn't go away when they lost. They retreated, regrouped, and waited for you to relax. He didn't. The next move came through the back door. Literally. 3 days after the demolition, around 3 in the morning, Ryder was jolted awake by the low, deliberate chime of one of the motion sensors he'd installed near the rear fence line. Not a deer, not a rabbit. This was human. The alert was programmed to distinguish weight and heat signatures, and this one wasn't subtle. Ryder didn't panic. He didn't grab the shotgun by reflex. He got dressed slowly, silently, like a man who'd prepared for this very moment. He stepped outside into the cold desert air, flashlight in one hand, sidearm holstered but unlatched, and began moving toward the source of the disturbance. He didn't need to go far. Two figures were already backing out from behind the barn. Dark clothes, no lights, one holding a shovel, the other a long metal pole. Ryder didn't recognize them, but he didn't need to. They weren't workers. They weren't officials. They were saboteurs, amateurs, but not dumb enough to stick around once they realized someone was watching. The moment Ryder called out, his voice calm but unmistakable, they bolted, disappearing into the tree line where an unmarked truck was waiting with its headlights off. The engine roared as they peeled away, tires kicking up gravel and throwing dust into the night. Ryder didn't chase them. He walked to the spot they'd been digging. There, half buried under a tarp and weighted down with gravel, was a coil of industrial-grade plastic piping, two spools of exposed wire, and a bag containing what looked like homemade anchors. It wasn't vandalism. It was groundwork. Someone had been trying to install a false line, some kind of infrastructure setup that could be later claimed as essential or pre-existing. He didn't need a full picture to understand what they were doing. If they couldn't take his land openly, they were going to try to embed something on it. Something they could later point to in court and say, "See, it was always part of the system." Not anymore. He photographed it all, called Len, and by dawn the sheriff's office had been notified. This time, Ryder didn't say no to law enforcement. He'd played his part. Now it was time to force the other side to defend theirs. The deputy who arrived was young but sharp, and when Ryder laid out the details, showed the evidence, and presented the motion recently filed in court, the kid took it seriously. For the first time since this began, someone from outside looked at Ryder not as a cranky landowner, but as the victim of a coordinated encroachment scheme. The investigation that followed was quiet but swift. Turns out Pamela had more than just community ambition. She had business interests. Her name was loosely connected to a private infrastructure firm that had recently submitted a proposal to expand broadband and utility coverage through the region. Her stake wasn't listed publicly, but someone traced the signature on one of the partnership filings, and sure enough, the initials matched. It wasn't conclusive, not yet, but it was enough for a judge to approve a temporary restraining order prohibiting the council from initiating any development-related activity within 100 feet of Ryder's property until the matter was resolved. The fallout was immediate. The council tried to spin it as a misunderstanding. Pamela released a carefully worded letter calling the incident regrettable and rooted in outdated survey data. But the damage had been done. Ryder didn't care about apologies. He didn't want an explanation. He wanted them gone. And now, for the first time, it wasn't just him saying it. It was the county, the courts, and a stack of evidence no amount of spin could erase. Still, Ryder didn't celebrate. He cleaned up the site behind the barn, reinforced the fence line, and installed 2 more motion sensors along the ridge. He didn't throw out the fake infrastructure parts. He kept them, labeled, sealed in a storage container near the pump house, just in case. He didn't believe in burning evidence. He believed in keeping receipts. And that night, as he sat on his porch with the desert wind brushing past his boots and the stars silent overhead, he knew one thing for certain. They might come again. But this time, they'd be trespassing on land already defended, and they wouldn't find him waiting with patience. They'd find him ready. In the weeks that followed the injunction, things on the ridge changed, but not in the way Pamela Stroud had envisioned when she first set her sights on the northern property line. Her name stopped appearing in community bulletins. The scheduled planning forums were quietly canceled, and the glossy trifold mailers about green corridors and shared land values disappeared from mailboxes as quickly as they'd arrived. There was no official resignation, no public announcement. She simply faded from view, the way people do when they realize the game they were playing isn't worth the cost of losing. But Ryder knew it wasn't over. Not truly. These kinds of battles never end with a gavel or a fence post. They linger, in paperwork, in meetings he'd never attend, in the quiet hostility of neighbors who'd chosen comfort over truth. Some of them waved at him now. Others looked away. No one spoke about the gate. No one mentioned the hearing or the sheriff's report or the restraining order still active against Pamela and any representatives acting on her behalf. But Ryder wasn't looking for apologies or unity. He didn't need to be liked. He needed to be left alone. The land settled. Not just legally, but physically. The scars from the dozer tracks faded into the gravel as new growth crept up along the edges of the road. The dust stopped tasting like confrontation. The cows returned to grazing as if nothing had happened. Life didn't go back to normal, because normal had never been the point. It simply resumed in the shape Ryder had always known it should be. Quiet, self-directed, unencumbered by the noise of people who mistook ambition for entitlement. Len kept him updated on the legal proceedings. There were murmurs of a formal review of Whispering Ridge's governance structure. County officials had begun scrutinizing several of their development permits. The drone incident, the infrastructure sabotage, and the forged access claims were still under investigation. There might be charges, there might not. Ryder didn't ask for details. He wasn't driven by punishment. He only cared that it never happened again. That winter, he installed a new entry gate, solid wood, custom-built without electronics or cameras, just a swinging crossbeam and a sign burned into the surface by hand. Private land, no access without invitation. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to be. It was a line in the dirt, plain and final, the kind of boundary that didn't beg for recognition, just enforcement. Neighbors still whispered, but a few came by. One brought pie. Another brought fencing wire he claimed he'd over-ordered. Ryder accepted both without comment, nodded his thanks, and went back to work. He knew some of them had stayed quiet during the worst of it not because they were complicit, but because they were scared. And maybe now, seeing how one man stood his ground, they'd remember what that looked like when it was their turn. He didn't talk about it. Not to them. Not to Len. Not to the deputy who still dropped by every few weeks to check in, under the pretense of friendly patrols. The story didn't need retelling. It lived in the broken steel stacked near the shed. It lived in the files he'd stored away in a fireproof box. And it lived in the simple, enduring fact that despite every form of pressure thrown at him, he was still here, and the land was still his. In the end, Ryder didn't win by yelling louder or pushing harder. He won by outlasting them, by knowing exactly what belonged to him and refusing to let anyone else define it, no matter how many signatures they collected, no matter how many polite letters they wrote, no matter how many names they put on a registry he never asked to join. And as spring crept back across the valley, and the hills turned green again under the weight of new sun, Ryder walked the edge of his pasture with a familiar gait, steady, weathered, and unbothered by the memory of the war they tried to bring to his door. The grass didn't care who filed the lawsuit. The wind didn't remember the council's votes, and the road, cleared and open, didn't stop anyone who knew where they were welcome. But it didn't let strangers pass without asking permission. Not anymore.